John Marlowe's hands were stained with grease, the familiar smell of motor oil thick in the air. The faint hum of the radio, barely audible over the clanging of tools, filled the small garage. His life was predictable, a monotonous cycle of repairing cars by day and nursing quiet bitterness by night. 5 years had passed since Clara left, but the wounds still festered. "John, there's a guy here to see you," his apprentice Sam called from the front. John wiped his hands on a rag and stepped into the sunlight. A man in a crisp navy suit stood waiting, holding a slim leather briefcase. His hair was meticulously combed, and he radiated an air of importance that didn't belong in their shabby corner of town. "Mr. Marlowe?" the man asked, extending a hand. "That's me," John replied warily, shaking it. "I'm Howard Greaves. I represent a law firm handling the estate of a Mr. Charles Marlowe, your grandfather." John froze. His grandfather had been a distant, enigmatic figure, the kind of man who disappeared for years and sent Christmas cards with no return address. They hadn't spoken since John was a teenager. "I think you've got the wrong guy," John said. Howard smiled faintly. "I assure you I don't. Your grandfather passed away 6 months ago, and after extensive searches, you've been identified as his sole heir." John blinked, trying to process the words. Sole heir? He didn't have anything to leave behind. "On the contrary, Mr. Marlowe." Howard reached into his briefcase and retrieved a folder. "Your grandfather left behind an estate worth approximately $18 million. The details are outlined here." For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. John stared at the papers, barely registering the words. 18 million? How could that be possible? "Why me?" he asked hoarsely. "Your grandfather was selective," Howard replied cryptically. "Perhaps it would be best to discuss this in detail at the property he left you. The mansion is just outside of town. Shall we?" The mansion loomed ahead, an imposing structure of weathered stone and ivy-clad walls. It sat on a sprawling estate, the kind John had only seen in magazines. "This is mine?" he asked, still incredulous, as they stepped through the ornate wrought-iron gates. Howard nodded. "Everything here, and more. The accounts, investments, offshore holdings. It's all detailed in the documents I gave you." Inside, the house was a time capsule. Dust-covered furniture and faded photographs hinted at a life of wealth and secrecy. John wandered through the grand hallways in a daze, feeling out of place in his grease-streaked clothes. In his grandfather's study, he found a letter addressed to him. The handwriting was spidery but deliberate. "John, wealth is a tool, not a treasure. Use it wisely, or it will destroy you." The cryptic message gnawed at him, but something else in the room caught his attention. A photo of Clara. She was smiling, holding a glass of champagne with Derek Cole beside her. The picture was from a society gala, the kind of event John could never have afforded. The sight of her reignited something in him, a spark of anger, humiliation, and something darker. Clara had chosen wealth over love. Now wealth was in his hands. "Mr. Greaves," John said, turning to the lawyer, "how soon can I access the funds?" Howard raised an eyebrow. "The accounts are already active. What are you planning, Mr. Marlowe?" John stared at the photo of Clara, his jaw tightening. "Just tying up some loose ends." Chapter 2. A Taste of Power. The sun sank below the horizon, casting the mansion in long, eerie shadows. John Marlowe stood in the study, the photograph of Clara and Derek resting on the polished desk in front of him. Their laughter seemed to echo in his mind, taunting him. He had spent the last few days absorbing the scope of his inheritance. Bank statements, investment portfolios, property deeds. It was overwhelming. For a man who had spent his life counting every dollar, the sheer magnitude of it all was intoxicating and disorienting. John's first stop was a high-end tailor in the city. The shop's gleaming windows and bespoke suits screamed luxury, and for the first time, John didn't feel the need to shy away. "Something timeless," he told the tailor, a wiry man who appraised him like a sculptor sizing up marble. "Timeless, yet commanding," the tailor replied with a nod. As the tape measure wrapped around him, John caught his reflection in the mirror. He barely recognized himself. His posture straighter, his expression colder. The grease-stained mechanic was gone. The transformation continued. A sleek black car arrived the next day, its engine purring like a contented predator. John drove it through town, passing places he once frequented. Familiar faces turned to watch, their eyes wide with curiosity and envy. At a coffee shop, an old acquaintance approached him. "John, is that you?" "Yeah, it's me," John replied casually. "Wow, what's going on? Did you win the lottery or something?" John smirked. "Something like that." The conversation felt hollow, a reminder of how people's attitudes changed when money entered the picture. It was a lesson he intended to exploit. In the following weeks, John began piecing together Derek Cole's empire. Evelyn Harper, the private investigator he hired, proved to be worth every penny. "This guy's as dirty as they come," Evelyn said, tossing a folder onto the desk. "Tax evasion, money laundering, bribery, you name it. He keeps most of his dealings under the radar, but he's left a few trails, enough to cause damage." John flipped through the files, his jaw tightening. Derek's wealth wasn't just built on ambition, it was built on exploiting others. "What about Clara?" John asked. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Still married to Derek. From what I've seen, she's enjoying the perks of being Mrs. Cole. Charity galas, designer clothes, the whole 9 yards. "Good," John said quietly. "Let her enjoy it while it lasts." The first blow came subtly, a leak to the media about a fraudulent deal Derek had orchestrated. The story spread quickly, tarnishing his reputation in business circles. The second strike was more personal. John anonymously donated a significant sum to a charity Clara publicly supported, ensuring the press credited Derek's rival. Well, the moves were small but strategic, sowing seeds of doubt and insecurity. Derek and Clara's perfect facade began to crack. Late one evening, John stood on the mansion's balcony, staring out at the sprawling estate. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Evelyn entered, her usual no-nonsense demeanor softened. "I have to ask," she said, crossing her arms. "What's your endgame here? You've got more money than you'll ever need. Why not just walk away?" John leaned against the railing, his eyes distant. "You ever been betrayed, Evelyn? Had someone you trusted throw you away like you were nothing?" She hesitated. "I've seen it happen." "Well, it happened to me," John said, his voice low. "And now, for the first time, I have the power to do something about it." Evelyn studied him, her expression unreadable. "Just be careful, John. Revenge has a way of consuming people. Don't lose yourself in it." As she left, her words lingered, but John brushed them aside. He had a plan, and nothing would stop him from seeing it through. Chapter 3. Cracks in the Facade. The morning news blared from a flat-screen TV in Derek Cole's sprawling penthouse. Derek sat at the marble counter, sipping his imported coffee, his expression tense as the anchor spoke. Scandal continues to brew around billionaire Derek Cole after allegations of fraudulent business dealings surfaced last week. While Cole Industries denies the claims, industry insiders suggest this could shake investor confidence. Clara walked in, her silk robe trailing behind her. "What's going on?" she asked, noticing Derek's clenched jaw. "Baseless accusations," Derek snapped, silencing the TV. "The media loves tearing down successful men." Clara studied him. "Are you sure there's nothing to it?" Derek shot her a sharp look. "Of course not. You think I built all this by cutting corners?" She didn't answer, but doubt flickered in her eyes. Elsewhere, John Marlowe sat in a quiet cafe, watching Derek's empire unravel. He scrolled through headlines on his tablet, each article a small victory. Across the table, Evelyn Harper sipped her coffee, smirking. "Your friend Derek's starting to sweat," she said. John leaned back satisfied. "Good. How's the next piece coming?" Evelyn slid a folder across the table. "Ready to go. These documents trace some shady offshore accounts straight back to him. Once this leaks, he'll have the IRS breathing down his neck." John nodded, but his gaze drifted to the bustling street outside. For all the progress he'd made, there was an emptiness to his victories. "You don't seem as thrilled as I expected. Evelyn observed. It's not enough, John admitted. Not yet. Evelyn shrugged. Well, you're the boss, but don't say I didn't warn you about getting too deep. That evening, Clara attended a gala without Derek. It was a glittering event filled with high society's elite, but her mood was far from celebratory. Whispers of Derek's troubles had followed her here, and she felt the weight of their judgmental stares. As she sipped champagne, a voice cut through the noise. Clara. She turned, her breath catching. Standing before her, in a perfectly tailored suit, was John. John? She stammered. Surprised to see me? He asked, a faint smile playing on his lips. I heard about your inheritance, she said, regaining her composure. Quite the windfall, John chuckled. It's amazing what life throws at you, isn't it? There was something unsettling about his calm demeanor, the way he held her gaze. Clara felt a flicker of unease. So what brings you here? She asked, trying to sound casual. Networking, John replied smoothly, and I couldn't resist saying hello. It's been a while. Clara hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She had always imagined John would fade into obscurity, but now he was here, thriving in a world she thought he could never belong to. I should go, she said, forcing a smile. Enjoy your evening. As she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that John's sudden appearance was no coincidence. Back at home, Derek was pacing in his office, barking orders over the phone. I don't care what it costs, just fix it. Clara entered, watching him for a moment before speaking. John Marlowe was at the gala tonight. Derek froze. Marlowe? The mechanic? Not anymore, Clara said, crossing her arms. He's different. Wealth changes people. Derek's eyes narrowed. What's he doing in our circles? I don't know, Clara admitted, but I think he's enjoying it. The next morning, a new headline hit the news. Derek Cole under federal investigation for offshore fraud. In his study, John leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smile on his face as he watched the news unfold. Clara and Derek had no idea what was coming next. But for the first time, he felt a twinge of unease. Evelyn's words echoed in his mind. Don't lose yourself in it. Chapter 4. The Cost of Vengeance. The tension in Derek Cole's penthouse was suffocating. Papers were strewn across the desk as his legal team spoke in hushed, urgent tones. Derek paced like a caged animal, his composure cracking with each passing second. Damage control, he barked at his lawyer. I don't care what it takes. Pay off the regulators, bury the accounts, just make it go away. It's not that simple, the lawyer replied hesitantly. Whoever leaked this has receipts, Derek. These aren't rumors, they're facts. It's airtight. Clara stood by the window watching the city lights flicker below. She had always admired Derek's confidence, his ability to bulldoze through problems. But now she saw desperation in his movements, a man losing his grip. Her mind drifted to John. She had replayed their brief encounter at the gala over and over. His confidence, his aura, it was unsettling. He had changed so much, and yet the man she left behind felt closer than ever, haunting her thoughts. Who's behind this? Derek growled, breaking her reverie. Clara hesitated. It could be anyone. You've made your share of enemies. Derek's glare was ice cold. Enemies don't hit this precisely without help. Someone's pulling strings. At the mansion, John was seated across from Evelyn in the dimly lit study. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows on the walls. Evelyn handed him another folder. This one's big. A list of bribes Derek's been paying out to politicians and regulators. Once we release this, it's game over. John flipped through the pages, nodding. Good, do it. But Evelyn didn't move. She leaned back, crossing her arms. You're really going all in, huh? No hesitation? John glanced at her. Why should I hesitate? This is what he deserves. Maybe, Evelyn said carefully, but have you thought about what comes after? Once Derek's gone, once Clara's humiliated, what then? John's jaw tightened. I'll figure that out when the time comes. Evelyn sighed. Just make sure you're not the one left with nothing. Revenge has a way of hollowing people out. A few days later, Clara found herself at a cafe, staring at the coffee in front of her. She barely noticed the bustling patrons around her. When John slid into the seat across from her, she jumped, startled. "You seem lost in thought," he said casually, his voice smooth and unbothered. Clara frowned. "What are you doing here?" "Coffee," he said, gesturing to the barista behind the counter. "You?" She hesitated, unsure how to answer. Finally, she said, "You seem different, John." "People change," he replied, his gaze piercing. "We grow, adapt. Sometimes life gives you a second chance." Clara studied him, her unease growing. "What do you want from me?" John leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I want you to see what you gave up." The words hit her like a slap. She opened her mouth to retort, but found herself at a loss. Before she could recover, John stood and left, leaving her to stew in her thoughts. That evening, the next bombshell dropped. Leaked documents reveal coal industry's web of bribery. The fallout was immediate. Politicians scrambled to distance themselves, and Derek's name became synonymous with scandal. Investors pulled out, and the stock plummeted. At home, Derek erupted in a fit of rage, smashing a glass against the wall. Clara stood in the doorway, watching him unravel. "This is your fault," he spat. "What are you talking about?" she shot back, incredulous. "You brought this into our lives," he shouted. "Your ex-husband is the one doing this. I know it." Clara froze. "John? Who else?" Derek snapped. "He's a nobody who suddenly comes into money, and now my life is falling apart? It's him. It has to be." Clara's mind raced. Could John really be behind this? The thought terrified her. Back at the mansion, John sat alone in the study. The television played in the background, recounting Derek's latest misfortunes. He had done it. The man who took everything from him was being torn apart piece by piece. And yet, as he stared at the fire, Evelyn's words came back to him. What comes after? The thrill of revenge was beginning to fade, leaving a hollow ache in its place. The mansion felt emptier than ever, and the memory of Clara's face at the cafe lingered in his mind. He thought of his grandfather's words. Wealth is a tool, not a treasure. Had he become the kind of man he once despised? Chapter 5. The Collapse. The chaos surrounding Derek Cole reached a fever pitch. News outlets dissected every detail of his empire's downfall, from the fraudulent business deals to the offshore accounts. His allies abandoned him, his fortune dwindled, and whispers of criminal charges loomed. For Clara, the once glamorous life she had built with Derek crumbled alongside his reputation. The invitations to exclusive events stopped, friends turned cold, and the lavish perks of being Mrs. Cole were fading fast. She found herself pacing the empty penthouse, her thoughts circling back to John. She couldn't ignore Derek's accusations any longer. If John was truly behind this, what did it mean? At the mansion, John stood in front of the ornate mirror in his bedroom, adjusting the cufflinks of his tailored shirt. The reflection staring back at him was unrecognizable from the man he had been just months ago. Evelyn walked in, her expression grim. "You've done it. Derek Cole is finished. The feds are closing in and his company's in shambles." John nodded but said nothing. "You should feel satisfied," she pressed, studying him. "This was your goal, wasn't it?" John turned to face her. "It was never just about Derek. It's about Clara, too." Evelyn sighed, leaning against the doorway. "You've proven your point. She left you for a man who's now lost everything. Isn't that enough?" John's jaw tightened. Not yet. That night, Clara sat alone in the penthouse's dimly lit living room, nursing a glass of wine. Derek was out, scrambling to salvage what he could of his empire. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft chime of her phone. It was a text from an unknown number. "Meet me tomorrow, noon, the park bench by the fountain." "John," her breath caught. She stared at the message, her heart pounding. A mix of fear, curiosity, and something else she couldn't name filled her. The next day, Clara arrived at the park. The winter air was crisp, and the fountain's water sparkled in the sunlight. She spotted John sitting on the bench, his posture relaxed, as if he didn't have a care in the world. She hesitated before walking over. "You came," John said as she sat beside him. "Why am I here, John?" Clara asked, her voice sharp. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I wanted you to see me, the real me," she scoffed. "The real you, the man who tore my husband's life apart?" John's smile was faint but cold. "He deserved it. And you knew it. You knew the kind of man he was, Clara. You just didn't care as long as the money kept flowing." She flinched. "You think you're better than him? You think what you've done makes you noble?" "I didn't say I was noble," John replied evenly. "But I didn't walk away from someone I claimed to love because they couldn't afford the lifestyle I wanted." The words hung in the air like a blade. Clara looked away, her throat tightening. "I made mistakes," she said quietly, "but so have you. Do you even know what you've become, John? You're not the man I married." John's jaw tightened. "No, I'm not. That man was weak. He let people walk all over him. This man," he gestured to himself, "this man has power, control." Clara turned back to him, tears welling in her eyes. "And yet you're still sitting here, trying to hurt me. If you're so powerful, why can't you let go?" The question struck him like a blow. He opened his mouth to respond, but found no words. She stood, her voice trembling. "You've destroyed everything, John, but it won't bring you peace. It never does." Clara walked away, leaving John alone on the bench, her words echoing in his mind. That night, Derek returned home to find Clara packing her things. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice laced with anger. "I'm leaving, Derek," she said firmly. "There's nothing left here." "You think you can just walk away from this? From me?" he shouted. She paused, meeting his gaze. "John didn't destroy you, Derek. You did, and I won't go down with you." Derek's face contorted with rage, but he said nothing as Clara closed the door behind her. John sat in his study, the fire casting flickering shadows across the walls. Evelyn's words, Clara's accusations, they all swirled in his mind. He had won. Derek was ruined. Clara was alone. But instead of feeling triumphant, he felt hollow. The words of his grandfather's letter surfaced once more. "Wealth is a tool, not a treasure. Use it wisely, or it will destroy you." For the first time, John wondered if he had been the one destroyed all along. Chapter 6. Redemption or Ruin. The mansion was eerily quiet. John Marlowe sat in the study, staring at the fire as it crackled in the hearth. The walls, once a symbol of his newfound power, now felt oppressive, closing in on him. The weight of his actions bore down on his chest like a stone. A sharp knock at the door broke the silence. Evelyn Harper stepped inside, her expression softer than usual. "I wasn't sure if you'd still be here," she said, taking a seat across from him. "Where else would I be?" John muttered. Evelyn studied him for a moment. "It's done, John. Derek's finished. His company's in shambles, and he's facing federal charges. Clara's left him. You've gotten everything you wanted." "Have I?" John asked, his voice hollow. Evelyn sighed. "I told you this would happen. Revenge doesn't fill the void." John leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I thought it would feel different, that it would fix everything. And now? Now I see that I burned my life to the ground just to light theirs on fire," he said bitterly. Evelyn hesitated, then stood. "You've still got a choice, John. You can let this define you, or you can figure out what kind of man you want to be." She left without another word, leaving John alone with his thoughts. The next morning, John drove to the park where he had last spoken to Clara. He sat on the same bench, staring at the fountain as children played nearby. When Clara appeared, he wasn't surprised. "You always had a habit of showing up where I least expected," she said, sitting beside him. John smirked faintly. "I could say the same about you." There was a long silence before he spoke again. "I wanted to say I'm sorry." Clara turned to him, startled. I lost myself, Clara, he continued. I let the money and the anger take over. I thought ruining Derek would fix everything, but all it did was make me realize how empty I felt since you left. Clara looked away, her expression pained. You're not the only one who made mistakes, John. I thought I needed Derek's money to feel safe, to be happy. But it was never enough. It was never real. She turned back to him, tears brimming in her eyes. We hurt each other in ways I don't think we can come back from. John nodded slowly. Maybe not. But I had to tell you. I had to try. Clara stood, her hands trembling. I hope you find peace, John. I really do. As she walked away, John felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time, he had let go. Weeks passed. John began making changes. He sold the mansion and donated much of his fortune to local charities, funding community centers, schools, and programs for people who had struggled like he once had. The money became a tool, just as his grandfather had written, a way to build rather than destroy. One day, he visited a local art gallery where he recognized a painting in the window. A peaceful park scene, the fountain at its center. Inside, he found Sophie Jenkins, the artist, setting up for a new exhibit. You have a good eye, she said, when she saw him admiring the painting. So do you, he replied, a genuine smile crossing his face. Their conversation flowed easily, and for the first time in years, John felt a spark of hope. Months later, the headlines read, Derek Cole sentenced to federal prison for fraud. John read the article without emotion, then folded the newspaper and placed it on the table. He no longer needed revenge to define him. As he walked through the bustling streets, he felt lighter. The scars of the past remained, but they no longer controlled him. In the distance, the fountains sparkled in the sunlight. Children laughed, couples strolled, and the world moved on. And so did John Marlowe.